There. I think we're live right now. Let me check. Or is it? Man. Oh, there we are. Alright, so we are now live. Hermes.
Hello. Good to talk to you today, Scald.
Yes, good to talk to you too. We are here. Well, let's first introduce ourselves because we have forced our fellow compatriots to shill this.
As we ought to have.
Yeah, as we ought. And I am Aloysia Shishima at MonadFan on Twitter. This is Hermes.
I am Hermes Trismegistus. I can be found on Twitter at Hermes2110.
Yes, and let's since this is a nice just discussion, let's start with I am here drinking a local cider, Whaleback Farm cider, a peach Damison.
I have a homemade kvass that I'm drinking tonight. It's a wonderful little fermented probiotic drink coming out of Eastern Europe.
Well, that is good to hear.
But I think I'm looking forward to this being a very good discussion, and I'm glad we're both very cozy tonight. I think, as any good discussion ought to be, it ought to emphasize a certain amount of coziness.
Yes, this is a personal, in a manner of speaking.
Socratic, I would imagine, is a good descriptor.
We're not going to be calling down from high just yet.
Not just yet.
Not just yet. And I'll just wait a bit until some actual people are watching.
I imagine this will be a VOD.
Well, yeah, VOD, but I would like people in.
Yeah, we'll give it a we'll give it a minute here for people to kind of flow in.
Yeah, it is just a first time, so we're not really too worked up as to whether or not we're getting a huge viewership.
We may get some, but the nature of these things, you know how it goes.
Yeah. Anyway, so let us begin. We were originally going to just be talking about virtue and other things, but a recent
let's say, disagreement.
I was going to say atrocity is what I was going to say.
As it tends to be the nature of these sort of things online, it seems that a friend of ours on the Twitter sphere has incurred the wrath of a group we might refer to as Apollonians.
Yes, we refuse to refer to them as Apollonians because they do not worship Apollo, and to do so would be to invite the wrath of Apollo himself, and frankly, I'm not about that. It would be very disrespectful.
Of course.
To be associating these atheists, these racist atheists,
self-admitted atheists, might I add.
Yeah, these racist atheists to not merely the deity of,
but to even consider them equals
of wisdom, but also of plague. And I like my health, so
as do I.
I will not associate them. So they are Apollonians or atrocity or whatever particular appellation we shall give them. Anyway,
I think we might start by kind of first describing what they are.
Yes.
We've kind of pointed out that they are atheists.
They are atheists, and a big problem I've discovered, actually, is that it seems that a lot of people don't really know what they are.
And that and I imagine that is to some degree intentionally.
Yes. I mean, not only do they lie about themselves, but they additionally like to shield themselves within
rhetoric
and and they're also a bunch of mealy-mouthed motherfuckers who who will say one thing and then immediately turn around and do another. So a lot of people don't really have a clear idea of what the Apollonians are, and even if many of them haven't even heard of them because they're ultimately kind of just an insignificant bunch of,
It is a kind of true to form fringe e-right movement.
It's just kind of a nothing.
It is, yeah. I mean,
and
even beyond the perspective of they have no meaningful influence in any amount of discourse. There's nothing even behind the ideas, which I think we ought to get into that then.
Yes. So this is just going to be a very brief
overview, yeah,
of why they're bad, which may not necessarily be as obvious as it seems. And I mean, there's obviously the whole atheist part, and then there's the whole they put racism before true belief.
And I imagine that is probably among the biggest offenders. What we might say, I think, is that for them, whatever might be referred to as belief and whatever it is they believe is ultimately a very modern understanding of it. It's ultimately ideology as tool, not ideology as a systematic view of the world, but just that they find a certain idea utilitous.
Yes, which is probably one of the greatest sins you can truly have when it comes to religion, is just seeing it as a means in and of itself. Now, this is not to say that having some degree of,
I think it is. I think it's fine to have an understanding of what is virtuous and what is good to be derived from religion.
Yes.
But when religion becomes a tool of a greater ideological system or a pre-existing belief system, you've got a problem.
Yeah, and not to mention that their conflation with the good being somehow impractical is itself a very big problem, because what is good is what is most effective and most practical.
And unfortunately, many who buy into ideologies, and certainly ones of a 19th and 20th century nature, almost always get blinded by these ideas to such a point that they cannot see anything else. Yeah. And that's where we kind of are with the Apollonians. The basis of their disagreement seems to me, at least, to be that they want some kind of, and this never existed, might I add, some kind of purity of Europe, as if there had ever been such a thing.
Yes, devoid of Semitic influences, which is basically impossible at this point, depending on how you define it all.
Well, I mean, and it essentially is, and it seems to be they seem to think that as well, considering they seem to regard that Odin is some kind of Semitic creation. How they go about instantiating such a claim, I've got no idea.
They claim it because wisdom and caring about, metaphysical things, that's Semitic, apparently. It's ridiculous. And before this whole kerfuffle, so to speak, occurred just recently, we were originally going to do this about virtue and what does make virtue, and we've decided that talking about these truly virtueless, impious curs is it's a very good way to start talking about virtue, because one of the best ways to talk about something is to talk about what it isn't, and they are certainly not virtuous.
That is very much the truth. We see from them a great deal of Nietzscheanism, which is
it's very easy to talk about, communists and liberals and Nazis and whatever, on how they're impious and how they're not virtuous. It's very easy to talk about that. It's a very low-hanging fruit, honestly.
Yeah, very much so.
Not really worth discussing, honestly.
Not really worth any serious investigation.
So the Apollonians, these are people who would shield themselves in the aesthetics and
Of
history. It's much more interesting to talk about because they have a lot of the trappings of what would appear to be virtuous without actually retaining any of the true qualities of virtue itself.
the basis of their whatever it might be called movement is around cloaking themselves in that Apollo is a truly solely European deity, of
Well,
which I don't even think that is entirely accurate.
it likely isn't. I mean, I'm of the opinion that Apollo is likely heavily influenced by Shamash, the Mesopotamian deity of law and the sun and all that. The domains of which they are associated, along with their general attitudes, are extraordinarily similar.
Yeah, and we know historically the Greeks have been in contact with the rest of the Mediterranean world for about as long as they've had boats.
Hellenistic
So
religion itself is extremely influenced by Oriental sources such as Phoenicians and Mesopotamians.
yes,
Either
it is incredibly unlikely that Phoenician merchants in Hellas didn't transmit some religious ideas regarding a sun deity.
yeah, and I mean it was either mediated through the Hittites or the Egyptians during the Bronze Age, or directly through the Phoenicians during the Iron Age.
But either way you
And
put it, it's got Semitic influence.
yes, and talking about like this fear of Semiticism is kind of absurd because none of these people are anti-civilization or anything, even though like urbanism itself was developed first
Yeah,
and
to
foremost
Mesopotamia.
is very much quote unquote Semitic, whatever that means.
Yeah, whatever a broad swath paint of the entirety of the Orient.
Apparently quite quiet. Um, let me bring my mic a little bit closer so you can hear me a little bit more. I just don't really speak much. I do not like speaking too much. Maybe I'll just turn you down a little bit. You're much louder.
Well, I'm a natural speaker and orator, so that might.
I don't want to start yelling. I mean, in an enclosed space, we're gonna get a lot of echoes.
Yeah, I understand, but you sound good to me now.
All right, so.
But that is certainly a problem I think the Apollonians have, is these ridiculous, terminology regarding that this or that. We can call particular cultures that we know of, and not to name names here, as being evil, but to paint a few thousand years of cultural and civilizational history of the Orient is a bit ridiculous, considering that Greeks and Romans, upon encountering these peoples, tended to find them very wise and tended to find great value in their cultures. And even in recent history, we have the artistic Orientalist movement of the 19th century. Europeans have always been fascinated to some extent by the Orient. The Orient has always been fascinated by Europe. It's a pretty natural interaction.
Yes, and we can even look at Neoplatonism itself. The Neoplatonic movement, let's put some mental quotes around Neo.
Of course.
Okay, we always have to put those quotes around it. Was fundamentally founded in a set of writings based in Mesopotamia called the Chaldean Oracles.
Yeah, everyone tends to forget just how heavily they drew on the Chaldean Oracles.
Yes. One could argue, true or not, that Neoplatonism is fundamentally a more Orientalization of Platonism, which, though I would argue that Platonism is a bit of an Occidentalization of Pythagoreanism.
I would make the argument that there is no great discontinuation. I make the argument, and this is I would draw from Lloyd P. Gerson's From Plato to Plotinus, that he argues that Plato kind of puts forth a complete doctrine that is ultimately still present within Plotinus, and that between the two, and even between later Neoplatonists, there really isn't a great distinction. So I wouldn't even go as far as to say is that Platonism orientalized. I would say it was just kind of naturally developed.
Perhaps not in the sense of like philosophy or theology.
Oh, definitely in the sense of where it ends up being centered, though.
Yeah, like aesthetics and focus on the center.
Yeah, definitely.
Neoplatonism definitely has a much more mystical angle than original Platonism did, so to speak.
I think there's a decent argument for that, especially when we start hitting Iamblichus, who kind of does begin to add more mystic concepts. And especially when although of course I think Platonism, when Plato was still walking the earth, was itself still a great deal more mystical than its competitors of Stoicism and Epicureanism.
Well,
so I think that was always a kind of a natural inevitability, but it definitely is helped by the fact that the Mediterranean, I would say as a whole, has always been a broadly very mystic area.
Yeah, I mean, you've got like to the point where you had people attributing even like the semi-tribal Iberians to having more advanced theological concepts in their religion than a lot of people would have you believe.
Yeah, looking at Basque forms of paganism, what remains of that sort of thing, and bell beaker. I believe the bell beakers reach down there. We see a lot of very deep religious concepts that you don't really see at much of what we might look at of Germanic paganism of the time. Though Germanic paganism would develop a bit, a few hundred years later, a far deeper mystical bent.
Yeah. Anyway, we've gotten way off track.
As I imagined we would.
Yes. Let's get back to talking about the Apollonians.
But that does bring us to where I think the Apollonians are wrong. One of their greatest faults, and this is a fault of all of modernity, is the dislike of the mystical.
Well, I would also argue in there is the belief in the exclusivism. There is but a singular, transmittable source of the truth, which is absurd when you
definitely
really get down to it. Like, you see this in Christians and Muslims and Jews and even Hindus, Buddhists and whatnot, and they believe that it needs to be some sort of continuous
exclusionary
single source that is the root of all righteous practice, which always I understand that a continuous single root is definitely superior to nothing,
and it's just far more utilitous, but there is, I don't think, any one single root. Like, I think it would be quite preposterous to propose that one group of people gained the absolute truth. Sometimes it gets posed to Platonists why there's such a focus on the Greeks, and it's really just a matter of happenstance. That you had this period of time where Greeks were producing a great deal of philosophy, but they don't very much anymore, and so we tend not to focus too much on it.
It was very probably, honestly, a consequence of circumstance rather than
it absolutely was
inherent quality of the Hellenes themselves. Let's not call them Greeks. We call moderns.
Yes, of course.
Those are Greeks.
Those are Greeks.
We're talking about Hellenes here.
But I think it is that is a kind of a very and I think it is to some degree still a modern problem, or at least modernity has promulgated this ancient, Judaic and Christian concept of a singular transmittable line of truth. And I think we definitely see that very much in an admittedly atheistic movement. This is one of the things that they directly admit, though it can be a little bit hard to pull out of them, that they do not really believe in any sort of deity in any meaningful sense. The deity is nothing more than an archetype.
Well,
Yeah,
the whole archetypical deity thing is like one of the circumstances of what I like to think of as almost true.
there's some truth.
They're almost right. It's like Buddhism. Buddhism is almost right, but it's not quite
There's
right.
one little thing keeping it off from it.
Yeah, like
Um,
when they speak of like archetypes, it is true to the extent that the gods do have uniting principles, so to speak.
yeah, and they do have. Proclus does this in the Elements of Theology and the Theology of Plato, where he ascribes these particular triadal roles to the deities, and he kind of points out that these deities maintain this sort of purpose in the universe, and this is their essence, this is their potency, this is their activity, and to that extent, putting Zeus in the role of the archetype of the father, of the king, and of the generator of things is accurate. But where the Apollonians fall short is not actually believing in it.
Yeah, it's misunderstanding the archetypes as arising from the god, rather than ascribing deities to being as of the archetype, so to speak.
Yeah, to the Apollonians, the archetype exists first, and then they just slot in the deity. And I think that actually has its origins in the infamous Varg.
I would say it's really more originally Jungian.
Well, yeah, but I don't think Jung was really meant to taking it there. I think he was using it as a purely psychological element.
Yeah, I don't think Jung himself believed, but
tends to get taken there.
Yes, it tends to be taken in the manner that no, it's actually archetypes. Not that archetypes are just useful methods of categorization.
And they are definitely.
It makes it easier to understand a deity. For example, to say that Zeus is Baal, and Baal is Enlil, and Enlil is Ahura Mazda, and so forth. It gives you a better idea of how
it allows a kind of cross-cultural understanding of these things,
and a deeper central understanding of the core root.
Demiurge. What the generative nature of demiurge is, or the generative, or the essence and potencies of
It's understanding how, despite the superficial differences, that these are all the same, and it is not in spite of their differences, but it is because of them.
Yeah.
And you can actually think about that and try to understand how these things are tied together.
With, as I kind of always point out in these discussions, with each god retaining divine uniqueness amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Because that tends to get a little bit lost in translation when you say that sort of thing. But I think it's always important to point out the divine uniqueness. But so we might say then that one of their great vices is to be almost intentionally blinded to the truth that is just a step out of the door for them.
Yeah.
We might also say, to some degree, that they simply refuse to engage in the piety.
Yes. Bringing it back to our original point is they have a certain arrogance about them. In talking about like what makes them not virtuous, they almost seem blithe to the concept of acknowledging that the gods are being like more powerful than them, so to speak.
And that is a consistent problem in much of the neo-pagan sphere, if we might even call it that.
People like talking about working with a god as if you're somehow on equal footing at all.
Yeah, as if one does not merely submit.
Yes. I do not work with Mithra. I am
a supplicant.
I am a tool to be used effectively.
And that's definitely a source of great impiety from the Apollonianists.
So what is virtue? Well, we know it's definitely not putting yourself on equal footing with the gods. This is manifested in a lot of ways in the world, not just in regards to the gods, but all social fabric ultimately is a reflection of man's relationship with the gods when you really get down to it.
Yeah.
And in much the same way that you ought to respect the gods because they are your betters, you should respect your father and your superior.
Yeah, that those same hierarchical positions exist within our own sort of sphere down here in the mundane.
Yeah.
But I think Iamblichus does note that the manner in which we acknowledge the superiority of the gods should still be different from the manner in which you acknowledge the superiority of,
of course,
say, your social betters.
Yes. It is very important to remember is that we should not conflate the material world with the spiritual. That this is but a pale reflection of the true substantive world.
Yeah, in a kind of literal sense, where matter is just a kind of series of mirrors that is kind of bouncing off the images of the true forms. But to kind of try to...
We should stay away from monadism.
We definitely should. That's a different topic.
That is an entire, several-hour discussion in and of itself. But I would like to have at least 2 other people here for that.
But to try to answer the question of what is virtue...
What is virtue?
I've always liked the answer that virtue is purification. I think
virtue is being the perfect version of yourself.
Yeah, that is. It is both the end and the way. I think is the best way to think.
I mean, I'm very influenced by Confucianism. I think I've talked about that before amongst us. And to Confucianism, it is essentially adhering to your role as superiorly as possible.
Yeah, whatever that role in the world is.
It's not being brave or frugal or any of those things. It's entirely not necessarily circumstantial, but it's definitely dependent.
I would say it's dependent on the kind of the providence that has been laid down upon your life. Would be a good way to think about it.
Just as the virtue of being like a farmer is different than the virtue of being a king. The virtue of being a king is very different than the virtue of being a priest. But this isn't to say that
their virtue is entirely separate.
Yeah. I mean, they're all tied together. I mean, what the virtue of a king is, in a sense, the bigger virtue of being a father or any, like, a slave
or any
master.
leader. Yeah.
It's
and I think that is a good way to think about virtue, because people tend to get, this is one of the faults of, I think, Aristotle, when he kind of tries to lay out what heroic or what virtue is as a general principle, is that it kind of in the end comes across as a little bit too vague. That it's simply too easy to get lost within this kind of broad abstraction of virtue. The way I think about virtue is, it is the mastery of oneself internally and the mastery of oneself externally. So I definitely agree with the almost kind of dharmic interpretation that it's in adherence to what you ought to be, but it's also in adherence, I think, to the mastery of one's own internal self.
Yeah. And it also fits well into an understanding of a life with metempsychosis, that the purpose to live is to experience. And if everyone were the same, then what would be the point?
Yeah, there would be no difference of there would be no difference or any real purpose in having a kind of discordant material world.
Yeah.
Which there's something to be said about that, but that's a different discussion. But kind of so moving then on, I think, to further an understanding of virtue. Plotinus kind of lays down this pathway of virtue, and I think you kind of hit the point that he initially begins on, that the first stage of the development of virtue is the development of one's civic virtues. That you have to do that before you can really begin on a deeper path of virtue. You have to civically virtuize yourself.
Yeah, of course. You can't really perfect yourself without first reaching a certain baseline.
Yeah. And that's as well something about virtue that gets lost, is that it's a pathway. We might call it to some extent the hero's journey, I think. Because I
don't want to make that comparison.
Well, I think that's a useful term in regards to, when we think of stories, we think of the kind of the progression of the hero of the story, and to some extent we're always the heroes of our own stories, I think.
to a degree. I would say that I suppose that all of the heroic, capital H, obviously, heroic stories are ones about learning virtue.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what I'm really getting at is that we can kind of draw from them that their stories are always kind of about learning, what is best, really.
So just a quick aside to our viewers, you can chat in the chat if you have any questions.
Oh, yeah, feel free to throw questions at us.
Yeah, we're not. This is the reason we're streaming this and didn't just record this is because we do, in fact, want some participation.
Yeah, kind of to make it as personable and Socratic as possible.
The purpose of discussion is to discuss. I like to say that argument is utterly useless. It really is completely useless, because you're just trying to prove that you're right rather than actually improving your own knowledge.
Which is something we're definitely trying to avoid here, I think. Yeah. But with that said, I think until something comes up, I think we ought to continue to truck along here.
Yes. As we were saying, is in perfecting yourself.
Yeah, it is in the perfection, and I think there's a kind of a dual-fold nature there, as I've kind of pointed out. The perfection of the external life and the perfection of the internal life. And I think we might, to kind of draw even further back to one of the problems of Apollonianism and of many modernist movements, is the kind of almost inbuilt assumption that men are already virtuous naturally.
Well, they have the capacity to be virtuous always within themselves.
Man always has the capacity to be virtuous.
And they have the inclination towards virtue.
Definitely. So, but and Plotinus kind of points us out, though, that when men begin down the path of ignobility, they have a tendency to continue down the path of ignobility.
It's easier, so to speak, to keep going downhill.
It's easier to go downhill than it is uphill. He describes it as falling in mud, and it covering yourself, and you become blinded, and then you can't see your way, and you fall in more mud. And virtue is the process of cleaning oneself, which we can kind of see in a more direct ancient concept of miasma, kind of spiritual uncleanliness. But this is so much of the problem of kind of modernity is a general disregard for virtue. a general dislike of.
People do not want to perfect themselves. They want to
No.
accept things.
Yeah. There's very much, and I think we might as well lay this bare on the history of, I think, an exclusionary understanding of truth is this idea of virtue and as being deontological, which for those of you who have not taken, as I have, an intro to philosophy course, deontology is a type of ethics that assumes a kind of, and this is going to get into a little bit of a funky discussion here, but it assumes a kind of set of absolute unchanging laws that are absolutely intuitable.
Yes, and
while there's some truth to that, I think there are natural laws to some extent. But I would definitely say the problem with a deontological understanding of that is that you kind of come not to actually understand those natural laws yourself. You come to be told them, rather than following through on the process of becoming a better person yourself.
Yeah. While the truth is utterly intuitable, being perfectly logical, and us being given the ability to be logical, it's just within ourselves to begin with.
Yeah.
We don't need an external force to tell us how to be virtuous. It's certainly helpful.
It is definitely helpful to have some authority which has the capacity to go, this is what the good is and this is what the truth is. But the problem with a culture that refuses to accept virtue and only accepts the rules as given, doesn't come to really understand those rules. And the minute the authority which has instantiated those rules suffers any sort of weakness from within or from without, the masses tend to abandon those laws because nothing's holding them to it anymore. And so any hope for a good society must be a society that concerns itself at some level with the teaching of virtue.
Yes.
Whether by your father, your mother, your mentors, you yourself.
A just society is always leading you to virtuousness, either by example or active instruction.
But if it is merely commanding you that this is what it is, you must do it, and it isn't leading you to it, it's done you no good.
It is not enough to simply be told. For example, I forget which dialogue, but Socrates, talking about epistemology, essentially.
I want to say the Meno.
I probably was. I don't remember all of them. I am slightly tipsy right now, if I'm being honest. He could have simply told the slave how to produce, I think it was a triangle?
Yeah, it was.
It was a triangle, to simply produce a triangle from squares. And the slave would have known, but he decided instead to guide them along so that they could come to understand itself, because there is no true learning. You are merely drawing out the knowledge within yourself.
Yeah. And I think epistemology is definitely something we should add to the docket of things worth talking about.
Yes. When we have more people.
But
2 people is a good amount for virtue.
But more is definitely needed for epistemology. But there is something to that in regards to virtue. Is when one observes some. So this is another bit of the Socratic dialogues to pull from there. I believe it's in either the Phaedo or I believe it's the Phaedo, in which Socrates is kind of enumerating the nature of how one comes to, the nature of the world. He points out that when one sees something, one is naturally drawn to something else in the seeing of something. So when you see someone who is virtuous, when you see someone who is good, and you are open and receptive to it, you will kind of be drawn not to that person, but to the thing that they're doing, to the virtue they're doing, and to the idea of virtue and to the idea of virtue within you. And so ultimately, this is and I'm going to spit this line out here as if it was a kind of ecstatic phrase, but all thinking and all learning is in truth self-thinking and self-learning.
Yes. Even devoid of the notion of the monad as all things being a contemplation of itself. Ultimately, all one's perceptions are merely feeding into one's internal thoughts. May Zeus forgive me, but I'm about to reference Descartes. You cannot. All senses are ultimately flawed. You can't truly trust them.
Yeah.
And that any what's the word? It's you know, like, you can only trust your senses, that as a ideology.
Oh, empiricism.
Empiricism, yes. And that you can't trust the empirical, because to trust the empirical you must use the empirical, which is
it's a self-feedback problem.
It's got a serious problem with self-feedback, and ultimately, what you it's really hitting me. You can continue on. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I understand. Ultimately, the problem, I think, to some degree arises from empiricism is that it, in a way, kind of tricks oneself into being closed off from this internal form, and it kind of closes oneself off from the observation, or from taking in external observations and placing them within oneself and contemplating them. And this is the fault of so much of modernity, is a kind of unwillingness to self-contemplate, to make all of these various interactions you have with the world distinct, minute interactions that don't even really fit in anything bigger. So something happens to you, and then that's it.
I would say, I've caught it again, it is taking the impetus for understanding outside of oneself, placing it outside, and essentially reducing any thinking rational beings to merely being automata of some sort.
Yeah. Always being led around by the nose by some biological impulse, or some, what's the phrase? It's emergent behaviors.
Emergent behaviors. Ridiculous. Ridiculous notion. We need to get, if we're not going to tackle materialism and materialistic atheism, but
not in this conversation.
When we do, we need Demosthenes for that.
Yeah, I think he'll be good for that one.
He's just a one-man crusade against that. If our loyal watchers aren't watching, follow Demosthenes. Demosthenes. Whatever.
But
he's in our followers.
But and I think to some degree we're kind of hitting a rather interesting point, that all ignorability to some extent, I think, is kind of selfishness. It is a kind of turning away from everything.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of an absolute trust in the self alone, above all that is around us.
It's also simultaneously a complete lack of trust in the self.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely suffers from the problem of a complete lack of trust of the self and a complete assurity of the self at the same time.
It's a bit of an inconsistent worldview, but that's how you know it's wrong. It's irrational not that it's just, inconvenient, or that it's it's that it's self-defeating, is that if you actually think about it a little bit, it instantly argues against itself. Like, how can you know that which is empirically true is actually true? By empirical knowledge, of course.
Yeah, and there's been all sorts of, funny things they've tried to pull over the years to make that sort of nonsense work, but that's a conversation we're gonna have to put on the docket. I think.
Yes, that's on the back burner for now. But back to the virtue.
Yeah, back to so we've laid out to some extent what virtue is.
Being virtuous is perfecting yourself.
The process of virtue is the process of the perfection of the self by some method or by some means. And it is both personal and universal, internal and external. And I think that we might lay bare as the ultimate problem of the Apollonians in the negation of them is that ultimate problem of which we've come to in assessing modernity, is that the ultimately modern person both absolutely trusts himself and absolutely does not trust himself in every sense. And that is the ultimate flaw of most of these groups.
He trusts his senses.
He trusts his senses, but he divests his senses of himself.
Yes.
His senses are almost external.
It's a certain amount of depersonalization of the self that essentially turns oneself into a slave.
Yeah, you and the kind of the modernist, you are nothing more than a series of internal wiring running a meat body.
Well, I mean, we see, we're actually a soul.
Yeah, you're actually a soul, and that's the real you. But the body is, to still some extent, just an extension of you, in a kind of an awkward method.
It's like a puppet on some strings.
Rather than the kind of modernist view where you are ultimately nothing. Let's see, what else might be said about the nature of virtue?
What about virtue?
I think laying out a general template of virtue is a necessary thing here. Yes. I think it's worth pointing out that
what is virtuous is what is also what is good for one around oneself.
Yeah, it's good for oneself and good for everything around oneself.
It's easy to say what is virtue is what is perfect. That's easy. Because then it begs the question of what is perfect.
Yeah.
And to say what is perfect is what is best for all around oneself.
And to that extent, I think it's worth drawing up this kind of template Plotinus makes, where he points out something along the lines of that virtue, beyond the civic virtue, is defined by the control of your various appetitive and honorific desires by wisdom. And that ultimately, what is good is always contained by wisdom.
Yes. Let's use some specific examples.
Well, so I think the best example is always to go to courage. We see so many calls for courage in these days, and it's a good call, I might add. But one might be lacking in control of courage by wisdom, and so one becomes a foolhardy idiot that launches himself into every single
I believe
event.
Aristotle made that example, actually.
Aristotle does too.
Yes,
the golden mean.
Yes, is that it is not in foolhardiness. I mean, even the Germans, who believed that a death in battle was the most virtuous of deaths, still believed it was better to live than to die. Because to live, you could win, and the virtue of victory is better than the virtue of failure.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of one of the ultimate things about the virtues is we might call it broadly a problem of so much whatever we might call our sphere online and in person be that in a reaction to a world utterly deficient of virtue by and large, people launch themselves into an excess of virtue. Which one might think is a good thing, but isn't.
I wouldn't say it's an excess of virtue. It's an excess of virtue seeking.
Yeah, and that might be a good way to think about it. It is an excess of desire of virtue.
It's the very same impulse that causes people to seek monasticism or hermitage or what have you.
Yeah, and it suffers under the same problem ultimately that the hedonist suffers under, is that those are both reactions and are not tempered by wisdom. Those are both just kind of pure follow. When you do that sort of thing, you are following in the train of your own desire.
Let us use a bit of Socratic dialogue, so to speak, the Socratic method, to understand why it's bad. Because it's easy enough to say being a monastic, being a hedonist is bad. Well, let's say you are a virtuous man and you are disgusted with the world around you. Not too difficult a concept to understand nowadays.
Of course.
And you think, oh, I am virtuous. I need to do my best virtue. So I shall seclude myself from the rest of the world. But that is not virtuous because you are taking your virtue and removing it from the rest of the world. You're not spreading it around.
Yeah, so we might ask the question, in fleeing from the world, are you doing what is best for all that is around you? And the answer seems to be no.
Yes, it's like the same fundamental problem with priestly chastity. Well, not chastity, celibacy.
No, chastity is the right word.
Chastity is good because it means no fornication. Celibacy is bad.
Oh, yeah.
Is that you are taking what should be the most virtuous member of your society, who is essentially acting as a patriarchal figure to their community.
Yeah.
And instead of allowing them to do the best good that they could do and passing on these values directly to their sons and their daughters, you're putting the impetus on succession on people who are not associated with that.
Yeah, who are indirectly connected to this individual. And those individuals may draw a good deal of virtue from him, but whatever virtue that might be gained is always greater in direct connection with it.
Yes. Is that while being chaste is good. I think it's kind of undeniable, but that chastity is a moral good. The excess of it, celibacy. And that does no good because you are denying part of the world that the gods have made, the world that is, by virtue of being of the gods, good.
Yeah.
Fundamentally. You are denying a part of that being reproduction.
The act of
pleasure.
Yeah, the act of erotic love of someone you are connected to is not in any way an immoral action.
Yes. It's normal. It is normal to have these sexual desires, or else you wouldn't have them.
And that is definitely, I think, another one of the great problems of the excess of virtue seeking is a fear of these things. And I think as well we might want to put on the docket a conversation of, the nature of priestliness in a society. That's something we should definitely seek to investigate.
That is definitely very important. I think we should probably have a pamphlet ready for that. That's definitely something. And if you want to do this, we have a pamphlet ready for you right now, ready to go. Um, but yes, back to the idea is that like you can trace very clearly that why this is a bad idea.
And we can follow the chain of logic there from the presuppositions we've laid out.
It's easy to say, oh, chastity is good, more chastity is better, therefore priests being the most moral members of society, having the ultimate chastity, celibacy is good. That's easy to say.
Yeah, and no one would blame anyone for arriving at that conclusion, I think. But it is an incorrect one.
It is definitely, and that's not even to say that ritual celibacy is necessarily wrong.
But that's a different thing.
The Vestal virgins were celibate, and no one would dare say that they were like being immoral, but that it was it was
a limited.
Yes, because there was the understanding that at some later date
they would, upon leaving the priesthood, and they were among the most desirable of matches as well.
Yes, because you have the most virtuous person.
Yeah, you suddenly have the most virtuous wife you can have,
and that
was a very big deal.
It was, and it was fashionable, but it was fashionable because it was virtuous.
Yeah, it was genuinely a society that knew what was good. And we might look to as well the priesthood of Jupiter, which required that a man be married.
And that he be married, and that he had never had, I believe it was that he never had a wife before either.
Yes, he had to have married his, I suppose, true love.
Kind of tougher to prove, but
I think that's a romantic way of thinking about it, if nothing else.
It's and that the woman had never married before as well, and that if either one had died, both of them
would be expelled from the priesthood.
Yes, is because ultimately, in following the gods, you are trying to emulate them to a specific degree,
and that comes up very closely within Iamblichus's The Mystery of the Egyptians, where essentially the whole of the work is about that. The proper function of virtue is the alignment of oneself ultimately with the gods. And through virtue, we kind of imitate the gods as well.
Yeah. It's, like, being a priest of a specific deity, their virtue is not merely defined by being merely exemplarily moral, but also exemplary virtuous in the manner that their deity prescribes.
Yeah, that's something that's, I imagine, lost in the conversation about virtue oftentimes. But as you've kind of pointed out, in the kind of Confucian understanding of virtue, that the nature of an individual's virtue to some extent is going to differ. Based on what you are and what you do, what is virtuous for you is always going to be a little bit different. No one, would lambaste a farmer for not being a warrior.
Yeah, it would be fundamentally ridiculous to demand someone to be something that they're not.
And to that extent, it's as ridiculous as well to demand that every individual adhere to the exact same particular morality. There is, I think, a broad morality, but dependent on the individual, of their nature, and of which god their soul is in series of, I think to some extent the nature of how they're going to act in a moral sense is going to differ.
Yeah, and this is also like related even to like crimes itself. Like, while people will say this is always wrong, it's not necessarily.
No.
A lot of crimes are highly circumstantial. There can be a moral murder, a moral theft.
Yeah, they definitely, and I think we see that definitely in a good deal of ancient cultures, that some forms of thievery were just understood as still being theft, but being acceptable. To draw up on the Celtic peoples, I believe they regarded the idea of stealing cattle as being an acceptable form of thievery. That it was not dishonorable to engage in cattle thieving.
Yeah, because it was a demonstration of skill, a certain kind of virtue in and of itself. Taking a large herd of cattle under the cover of night
without anybody noticing. And if anybody's ever been around cows, and I have, that's quite a feat, I have to admit.
They're either far too easily startled or really stupid and won't understand when you tell them to go.
So there's definitely, and this is, of course, as well one of the problems of a deontological understanding of virtue, is it doesn't allow for the variety of contexts of actions. That some things in some certain contexts is going to be correct. And when we look through ancient ancient laws, we see this sort of thing come up where, we'll see an event where someone was murdered, but the circumstance around the murder was such that to kill them was honorable.
It would have been more unjust to
not fight them. We see when Tacitus talks about the Germans, we see that. Funny enough, by the way, as an aside, I believe the German courts still today recognize the defense of one's virtue as a legitimate reason to get into a fight. I believe that is still something the German legal system recognizes.
Big if true. But I would agree, is that it's definitely very circumstantial, and that it fundamentally is a problem with a lot of these, like, generalist religions or moral systems, is that it applies universal standards to a non-universal system.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason for the differences, I think, of peoples as well, is that they're going to have different mores and virtues, and they're going to engage with certain virtues in different ways as is appropriate to them. No one, I think, would lambast, or no one would think ill of an ancient Germanic warrior for being a warrior, any more than one should think ill of, Oriental cultures for favoring a more settled existence.
Oof. That's another thing some people online will talk about, is the virtues of being a nomad.
Well, I mean, if one is descendant of nomad stock, then it is a good thing to aspire to, but not all of us are.
There's nothing wrong with being proud of one's ancestry.
Definitely not.
I mean, I would say there's something wrong with not being proud of it to a degree.
Yeah, that's certainly ill-virtuous.
Yes. But yes, it is. What track were we on before that immediate?
We were talking about the nature of the variety of virtue.
Yes, the variety of virtue, and it even was highly dependent upon the very society itself. In a society that believed the ultimate virtue was in strength, and it was necessarily strength because of the hardship of their life. They could not afford to have a weak or impotent ruler. It would be odd to tell them, and I think it would be legitimately odd to even assert, that no, their desire to have, like, violent, strong leaders was bad, because it was a legitimately harsh existence.
Yeah, was their good.
Yes. They could not have survived under a more pacifistic philosopher like Pythagoras.
Yeah, definitely. And this is and as you kind of pointed out, this is a problem of any universalist approach to ethics. Is that you end up with, of course, steppe nomads wouldn't have fared well under a philosopher king any more than, the Greeks would have fared well under a steppe nomad warlord. Yeah. And I think so to kind of draw up some summation, I think, of the points we've hit, and I think that's necessary. We might say ultimately that virtue is specific to one's nature in life, but that there is a broad template that individuals engaging with virtue need to follow, and that ultimately virtue is about the mastery of oneself in one's own life and in one's own particular role for the performance of becoming what is best for you and best for the world around you in imitation of the gods.
And, very importantly, it's not just the virtue of the individual being the perfect version of themselves, but it's the society around them being the perfect version of themselves.
Yeah.
To bring back to the immediate statement that, like, the Scythians, they were attempting to be the perfect version of themselves. They were achieving a certain virtue of Ares that was
necessary for them.
Yes. And as much as I think that is a poor way to live, they were still achieving a virtue of their own way.
I think we've kind of hit the good points of what virtue's here, or what virtue is here, and I think with that we can draw to a conclusion.
Yeah, I think we've more or less hit all the most important parts of a discussion, at least for a first one.
Yeah, for a first discussion, I think we've kind of said what needs to be said, and laid the necessary groundwork. And I think it's always important to start any first discussion with the discussion of virtue.
Yes, and
I think we've said something very good here today.
It's a good place to start. So I would like this to happen at least semi-regularly.
Oh yeah, of course.
Maybe even weekly, because it really can't hurt to have some sort of ritual.
Yeah. I think definitely weekly is something we should shoot for.
Yeah. So,
but to that end, I think we ought to say good evening and goodbye to everyone.
Yes. So everyone, thanks for watching, or if you're watching the VOD, thank you for listening through an hour of semi-structured rambling.
Future topics may be a little bit more structured as well.
Hopefully, with more people, will get more structured.
Yeah, of course. But thank you, everyone. I thank you all for your time and for being here. And I wish everyone a good night or a good morning, wherever you are in the world.
Yep. So we will be heading out.
All right. And good night, Scald.
Good night.